The valley floor trembled, not from the earth itself, but from the cadence of a single man. The Philistine champion, a colossus cast in bronze and iron, stood in the center of the Elah Valley, his voice rolling across the dry hills like a thunderclap that refused to dissipate. He was a monument to conventional power, his armor catching the morning sun, casting blinding glints that felt like judgment upon the paralyzed ranks of the Israelites. Every step he took was a proclamation of the status quo. That power is measured by mass, that dominance is dictated by reach, and that victory belongs only to those who possess the largest tools of war. For 40 days, this rhythm had defined existence. To the Israelites, the giant was not merely a man. He was the embodiment of an inescapable reality. He represented the Goliath in every life, the insurmountable debt, the established competitor with the infinite budget, the critic who looms over your potential with a resume that dwarfs your own. He was the certainty that if you are smaller, you are destined for silence. But high above the valley floor, watching the rhythmic insolence of the champion, stood a shepherd. He was not a creature of the valley's rigid geometry. He was a creature of the wilderness, of the long, silent nights spent navigating the shadows of the Judean hills. To the onlookers, he was an absurdity. He carried no shield to match the giant's massive barrier, no spear to challenge the reach of a seasoned warrior. He carried only the quiet, unremarkable weight of his past. King Saul, frantic to maintain the facade of organized defense, approached the youth. The king's desperation was palpable, a frantic energy that sought to impose order on a world spiraling toward defeat. He looked at the boy, then at the massive, bronze-clad form in the valley below.
If you are to stand against that mountain, you must become as large as the mountain itself.
The king's servants rushed forward, laden with the royal mantle. They strapped a thick, polished breastplate onto the young man's shoulders. It was a masterpiece of military engineering, designed by the finest armorers of the age. They topped it with a heavy bronze helmet, a shell intended to deflect the most crushing of blows. In an instant, the shepherd was transformed. He was no longer a boy of the hills. He was a mirror image of the giant. He was being forcibly integrated into the system of standardized success. The sensation was immediate and suffocating. The armor was designed for a specific kind of combat, one where the warrior stands rooted, trading heavy, predictable blows in a static environment. It demanded a posture of rigidity. The metal weighed down his stride, forcing him to walk with the artificial, lumbering gait of a man who has surrendered his agility for protection. His vision was restricted to the narrow slits of the visor, turning the vast, dynamic world of the valley into a limited, claustrophobic tunnel. In that moment of encasement, the shepherd understood the great delusion of the age. We are taught that to contend with greatness, we must mirror it. We are told that to build a successful enterprise, we must replicate the corporate structures of the titans. To climb the professional ladder, we must adopt the same hollowed-out jargon and performative metrics as our superiors. We believe that by donning the armor of Saul, we gain the security of the status quo. We assume that because the armor worked for the king, it will be the salvation of the shepherd. But the shepherd felt the truth vibrating through the steel. This protection was, in fact, a trap. The armor was built for a game he was not playing. It was designed to turn men into statues, to stifle the very fluidity that allowed a shepherd to outmaneuver a prowling predator in the dark. It was a tool of the status quo, designed to maintain the existing hierarchy of the valley. By wearing it, he was not gaining an advantage. He was forfeiting his only real weapon, his ability to move in ways the giant could not anticipate. With a series of methodical, deliberate motions, he began to undo the straps. The buckles, forged for utility, groaned as he loosened them. He lifted the heavy breastplate, watching it clatter to the parched earth with a sound that seemed to mock the tension of the soldiers standing nearby. He reached up and unfastened the helmet, letting the cool, unrefined air of the valley wash over his face. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the shock of the onlookers. The king's court saw a man casting aside the only protection against the impending storm. They saw a fool rejecting the collective wisdom of the establishment. They saw a man committing a strategic heresy. But the shepherd was not discarding his defenses. He was shedding the weight of expectations. He was choosing the vulnerability of the open field over the stifling confinement of the status quo. He realized then that the giant's strength was predicated entirely on the expectation that his opponent would operate within the same geometry of conflict. If you play by the rules of the giant, using his armor, his language, his pace, you are merely a smaller, inferior version of his own self. You are a captive of his strategic paradigm. To be truly dangerous, one must become an anomaly. One must be willing to look like an amateur to the eyes of the establishment, precisely because one is busy mastering a reality they cannot fathom. As he walked away from the pile of discarded bronze, light as the wind, he felt the familiar, grounding weight of his leather pouch at his side. He had no illusions of miracles. He had only the cold, sharp understanding of a technician who knew that the most sophisticated piece of machinery in the world is rendered entirely inert if it is forced to operate outside of its intended environment. The valley waited, the rhythm of the giant continued, but the shepherd was no longer playing the king's game. He was ready to redefine the terms of the encounter, not by becoming a bigger player, but by becoming something entirely different. The valley floor of Elo was not merely a geographic depression, it was a theater of rigid expectations. Standing on the eastern slope, the shepherd observed the giant. From this distance, the figure was a masterclass in intimidation, his silhouette a testament to the idea that power is a function of scale. The giant shifted his weight, his heavy greaves digging into the soil, anchoring him to the earth. He waited, as he had for 40 days, for an adversary to emerge from the opposing ridge, an adversary he expected to arrive with the same clatter of metal and the same rhythmic, lung-straining march that he himself commanded. He was waiting for a mirror. He was prepared to engage in a duel of attrition, where weight would meet weight and shield would clash against shield. This was the geometry of the giant. A narrow, linear world where the outcome was determined by who could endure the longest and strike with the most crushing force. The shepherd stepped onto the valley floor, his feet bare against the pebbles, unburdened by the weight of royal metal. He moved with a cadence that defied the expectations of the observers on the ridge. He did not march. He flowed. He did not seek the center of the field, the natural arena for a duel, but instead began a wide, sweeping arc. It was a movement of subtle defiance, an intentional disruption of the spatial relationship between himself and the Colossus. Goliath watched, his confusion manifesting as a low, guttural rumble. He rotated his torso, his heavy armor limiting the speed of his turn. He was a creature of singular focus, a machine designed for the singular purpose of frontal collision. As the shepherd circled, the giant was forced to navigate the logistical nightmare of his own magnitude. Every movement he made was a grand, theatrical expenditure of energy, while the shepherd's movements were economic, precise, and entirely fluid. In that dance across the parched earth, the shepherd was applying a principle that the world often forgets. When you cannot win the game on your opponent's terms, you must alter the terrain itself. Goliath lived in a world of short distances, where his size was an absolute virtue. By refusing to close the gap, the shepherd was effectively nullifying the giant's reach. He was expanding the battlefield into a new dimension, one where the speed of a projectile mattered far more than the thickness of a breastplate. The shepherd reached into his pouch, his fingers finding the smooth, cool surface of a stone. This was not a weapon of war as the kings of the earth understood it. It was an extension of his own expertise, honed in the quiet, treacherous hours of the wilderness. He had learned that when you face an overwhelming force, you do not need to be stronger. You need to be faster, and you need to be precise. You need to strike the one point that the armor does not protect. The giant roared, a sound of frustration at the impossibility of the situation. He tried to charge, his massive form momentum-laden and inexorable, but the shepherd was already moving to a new coordinate. The geometry of the giant was failing. He was becoming a prisoner of his own scale, his weight turning into a liability that hindered his reaction time. He was looking for an enemy in front of him, but the shepherd was a presence that required a total recalibration of his perception. This is the hidden law of asymmetry. In modern life, we often view our lack of resources, the missing budget, the smaller network, the lack of traditional prestige, as a fundamental flaw. We look at the giants of our industries, those institutions that stand like bronze towers, and we assume that because we cannot match their scale, we cannot compete. But we fail to see the blind spot inherent in their size. The giant is so committed to his armor, so invested in his massive, slow-moving structures, that he becomes incapable of responding to a pivot. He cannot see the threat that operates at a different speed or from a different angle. The shepherd stopped. He did not look at the giant with fear, but with the dispassionate focus of a mathematician solving an equation. He held the sling, a device that in his hands acted as a slingshot of ancient design, capable of generating the force of a modern projectile, and began to swing it. The motion was a blur, a rhythmic, circular kinetic energy that ignored the giant's sword, his spear, and his immense, impenetrable shield. The giant stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing. For the first time, he realized that the rules of the encounter had been rewritten. The weight of his armor, once a symbol of his invincibility, now felt like a heavy, stifling shroud. He was a relic of a dying paradigm, an entity built for a struggle that was no longer taking place. The shepherd was not fighting the giant. He was dismantling the concept of the giant itself. The silence in the valley grew profound. The wind caught the shepherd's hair, his stance grounded, his mind entirely clear. He understood the vulnerability of the Goliath archetype. When you are at the pinnacle of strength, you lose the ability to be agile, to change, and to evolve. You become an object of history rather than a participant in the future. The shepherd's focus narrowed to a singular point, the only place where the giant was unprotected. He had successfully manipulated the environment to force the giant into an impossible choice. Either shed the armor and lose his identity as a champion, or remain encased and become a target for an unconventional strike. It was a masterclass in strategic positioning, a moment where the underdog moved from a state of peril to a state of absolute, surgical precision. The giant stood paralyzed, not by a lack of power, but by the shattering realization that he had been outmaneuvered long before the stone was even released. The stone left the leather cradle with a sharp, crisp snap, a sound that signaled not just the end of a skirmish, but the permanent collapse of an outdated paradigm. As the figure in the valley reached the apex of his fall, the metal of his armor chimed against the stones, a hollow, ringing bell that echoed across the hills. It was the sound of a history that had finally reached its expiration date. But for the shepherd, the victory was never about the stone, nor was it truly about the giant. It was about the revelation that followed. As the dust settled and the echoes died into the vast, indifferent silence of the valley, the shepherd stood amidst the stillness, breathing the air of a world that had suddenly grown much larger. He had entered the valley as an anomaly, an outcast from the royal courts of traditional thought, and he had emerged as a testament to the power of the unconventional. This is the ultimate resolution of the underdog's journey. You do not defeat your giants by becoming them. You defeat them by outlasting the rigidity of their own existence. The giant was a prisoner of his own scale, burdened by the weight of a legacy that demanded he remain static, predictable, and armored. He had no room to move, no capacity to learn, and no ability to imagine a reality where he was not the inevitable victor. His downfall was not the result of a single projectile. It was the inevitable consequence of a life spent avoiding the very discomfort that creates mastery. Look closely at your own valley. Who, or what, is the giant looming over your horizon? Perhaps it is the weight of an industry that dictates you must sacrifice your soul for a title, or the crushing pressure of a career path that mandates you wear the armor of a predecessor who never understood your potential. We often look at these forces and see a wall of impenetrable iron. We see the impossible standard of the competition, the overwhelming resources of the establishment, and the sheer momentum of those who have been here longer than we have. We see the armor, and we mistakenly believe it is a shield. But as the shepherd's journey teaches us, the armor is merely a cage. Every time you try to emulate the giant, every time you adopt their language, their habits, and their limitations, you are voluntarily tightening the bolts of your own constraints. You are choosing to be a smaller, slower, less capable version of something that is already obsolete. The true breakthrough occurs when you find the courage to cast that armor aside. It requires an immense, often terrifying, leap of faith to step into the open field and trust in your own agility, your own training, and your own unique perspective. The desirable difficulties you are facing right now, the lack of funding, the skepticism of your peers, the feeling of being an outsider in your own field, are not signs of your failure. They are the forge. They are the trials of the wilderness that have prepared you for this exact moment of confrontation. Just as the shepherd mastered the sling in the quiet, isolated hours far from the gaze of the king, your current struggles are refining your ability to strike at the exact point of vulnerability. You are not being held back. You are being sharpened. The resolution of the story is not a return to the status quo. The king did not get his armor back. The giant did not rise to resume his station. The valley was fundamentally transformed. When you successfully navigate the asymmetry of your challenge, you don't just win. You change the landscape for everyone who comes after you. You signal to the world that the age of the giant is fading, and the age of the agile, the creative, and the unconventional has begun. So, as you stand at the edge of your own valley, do not fear the scale of the adversary before you. Do not be intimidated by the roar of the status quo or the bronze-plated certainty of those who claim that there is only one way to climb the mountain. They are tethered to the ground by their own weight. You, however, possess the freedom of the open path. Identify your sling. Master the art of your own unique strategy. Recognize that the gap between you and your goal is not a distance to be bridged by force, but a space to be navigated by innovation. Refuse to be a mirror. Refuse to be an echo. The stones are waiting. The distance is set. And the giant is standing exactly where he believes he is invincible, unaware that the very thing he relies upon, his magnitude, his history, his unwavering belief in the old ways, is exactly what leaves him vulnerable to a vision he is not built to perceive. Take that step away from the armor. Trust the training that the world told you is unimportant. And when the time comes, let fly with the clarity of a man who knows that power is not measured by the armor you wear, but by the precision with which you choose to live your life. The giant is waiting, and he is waiting to be dismantled. It is time to step into the valley, not as a soldier of the old guard, but as the architect of a new reality. The world is built by those who are willing to look at the impossible, smile, and pick up the one stone that changes everything. Carry that resolve with you. The battle isn't coming. You are already in it, and you are far more capable than the scale of your obstacles would have you believe. Stand firm, move with purpose, and define the future on your own terms.